I am depending upon the sunlight today, and it was super bright when I started filming, but it looks like maybe the clouds have come out just a little bit. Hello and welcome to another video. If you're new here, my name is Erin and I am so glad to have you visiting my channel. Today's video is going to be tips for helping you get out of a reading slump, which was requested by my bestie, Jamie. Hi, Jamie. And so without further ado, let's just dive right into the video. I do want to say with these tips that these are just 5 tips that I have found helpful personally. This is by no means an exhaustive list, and every reader is different. And so what might work for me may not work for you, and vice versa. But these are just meant to give you a starting point if you are finding yourself in a reading slump and you want to get out of it. Tip number 1 is to read consistently, even if it's for short periods of time. One thing that I did last year was to read for at least 10 minutes every day, and I found that to be so incredibly helpful in building a consistent habit with reading, but it also helped to stave off any sort of reading slumps. Of course, there were some books that, I would start to feel like, I'm not enjoying this as much, but because I had such a small goal of 10 minutes each day, it was so much easier to sit down and read. And sooner rather than later, I would end up getting through some of those sections that were a little bit harder to read. And, 10 minutes is just what worked for me. You could try, setting like a specific amount of time to read each day. Or if you're more into pages, you could say, oh, I'll read this many pages each day. And keep that goal lower than you think, because if it's easy, then you're more inclined to do it, even on days when you don't really feel like it. It's much easier, I think, to convince yourself, I'm just going to read 1 page tonight versus a whole chapter. So make the goal small, make it reasonable, and make it really easy. And I think you'll find that it will help you get out of a reading slump slowly but surely. Tip number 2 is to read shorter books. So this could look like a book of poetry or short stories or even a novella. I also like to include in this category children's books. They are not just for children to enjoy. I think as an adult, reading children's books is, especially if it's one that you read as a kid, it can be so nostalgic. And they're also they have so many great life lessons. And I find that when I gravitate towards children's books, especially when I'm in a reading slump, it reinvigorates my love of reading and reminds me why I love books so much. So don't feel like, oh, it's a children's book or it's a shorter book, like I can't really count it. All reading is good reading, unless you're not enjoying it. So definitely try out reading shorter books if you find yourself in a reading slump and you want to reinvigorate that love of reading and also feel that sense of accomplishment that, hey, I read this book. So that's one of the tips that I have found that has worked really well for me. I apologize that the lighting might be getting a little bit darker. I am depending upon the sunlight today, and it was super bright when I started filming, but it looks like maybe the clouds have come out just a little bit, but we'll just keep rolling with it for now. Tip number 3 is to read an entirely different genre than what you typically read. I find this to be really helpful, especially if you gravitate towards one genre of literature and you're just in a slump with it. I think trying something completely different can make the reading experience really exciting, because you may not be familiar with some of the typical pacing of that type of story. So one example that I can think of, I tend to read a lot of classic literature, which I absolutely love. It does require a little bit more concentration. And so it is kind of nice to switch up genres from time to time. And one genre that I don't read very often that I have found really fun is switching to like a mystery, like a murder mystery type of story. And because I'm just not familiar with like the formula, and I'm also the type of reader that I don't try to guess who done it. And so I find switching from like classic literature to a murder mystery to be really fun, especially if the narrator is really engaging and the characters are really interesting. So switching up genres has definitely helped me in the past when I've been in a reading slump. Tip number 4 is to read a book that you are really excited about. If you're like me and sometimes you like to save books to read at specific times, if you find yourself in a reading slump, go ahead and read that one book that you are so excited to read. That, I think, is the time to really lean into those awesome books that you are just wanting to read so badly. So often I find that when I'm in a reading slump, I'm not as excited to read. And so when I have a book that I'm really excited to read, that just automatically helps me to move out of that reading slump. And tip number 5 is to DNF, or do not finish, did not finish, any book that you are not enjoying. That doesn't mean that you won't revisit that book at a later time, but it may be that that book is just not resonating with you, especially when you're in a reading slump. I think that trying to push through reading a book that you aren't enjoying can only put you further into a reading slump. And unless you have to read it for like an assignment or something like that, I think DNFing is a really useful tool for readers, and one that I'm definitely one who pushes myself to read through books because I don't know why I get caught up in this. I feel bad if I don't finish it. But just because you're DNFing a book doesn't mean that you'll never return to it again. And so don't be afraid to set a book aside if it's not resonating with you at that time, and know that you can always go back to it. And by DNFing a book that you aren't enjoying, you are then making room for another book that you could be enjoying, and therefore spending time reading a story that is really fun and engaging. So DNFing, it can be, a helpful tool. So don't be afraid to do that. And those are the 5 tips that I have put into practice in my own reading experience that I've found helpful. Again, these are not all of the tips for getting out of a reading slump, but just a few that I have found useful. And just some final thoughts that I want to leave you with. Everyone goes through reading slumps from time to time, so it's nothing to feel bad about. It's a very natural part of being a reader. There are going to be ebbs and flows with reading, and the reading slump will not last forever. It will eventually pass. So be patient with yourself, be kind to yourself, and know that you will enjoy reading again, and you won't always be in a reading slump. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments what tips that you have found helpful for getting yourself out of a reading slump. And if you liked this type of video and you have any requests for future videos you'd like to see from me, definitely leave those down in the comments below. And I would like to give a special thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. I host bonus content and behind the scenes content, as well as a book club. If you're curious to find out more, I will leave a link in the description box. And until next time, I hope you have a lovely and cozy book to curl up with. Bye-bye.